Hi, Terry here. Welcome to Times Gone Tech. I was just sitting here thinking, yeah, you believe that, don't you? I would just happen to be sitting here in front of a camera thinking, okay, but I have been thinking about my previous video that I did about the last gun, well, not the last gun, but if I could only own one gun, what would it be? Got some very interesting results on that. Good comments. Keep them coming. You don't have to agree with everything I say. We don't have to agree. We can agree to disagree. All right. But yeah, there were some good, well thought out comments there. But in that video, I did say something which I have said a couple of times in previous videos that I was thinking might give people the wrong impression. When I've said that I do not believe in the doomsday, end of the world, TEOTWAKI, last days, great SHTF scenario, that I just don't believe in that. Well, I'd like to take some time here very quickly to just kind of explain what I mean by that. Among YouTubers, especially YouTube preppers, let's say, there is this odd idea going around. It seems to be kind of prevalent right now that within the next few years, nobody knows exactly when, but within the next few years, all of Western civilization is going to just suddenly collapse. The power grid's going to fail. The government's going to just shut down. Social services are going to just stop. Transportation grid's going to just stop. Everything's going to stop. Everything's just going to shut down. And we're going to go to bed one night. Everything will be fine. We're going to wake up the next day and the whole world's just turned to shit. And people are trying to chew each other's fingers off. And life will then be a running gunfight forever after that. To me, that is an adolescent fantasy. I'm sorry, that's late 1960s, early 1970s post-apocalyptic movie, TV series bullshit, in my opinion. And I know because I grew up during those days. The general idea is that the machine, the infrastructure, has gotten so big and so complex and so fragile that it's going to just collapse like a house of cards. Well, no, what's really going to happen is the machine has gotten so big and so intricately interconnected that it can't just fail. Okay, now that's my opinion. You're certainly free to disagree with it, but I just don't think that's going to happen. Even if there was a major global depression, the police are going to keep doing their job. There's not going to be an end of rule of law. Law enforcement will keep operating. They might be cut back. Right? We might have to rely a little more on ourselves, but the law, the courts will still be there. The jails will still be open. The fire departments will still be running. The ambulances will still be running. Cell phones will still be up and running. Factories might cut back, but they'll still be up and running. Okay. But having said that, again, there are some events that could happen, which we could call TEOTWAKI or SHTF events, that would be strong enough to break the infrastructure. Now, these would be external events. This would not be a political decision. It would not be, 2 or 3 weak administrations. There wouldn't be anything like that. It wouldn't be China calling in the national debt. Nothing like that at all. This would be external physical events that could put so much pressure on the global environment as to break the physical infrastructure of Western civilization. Now, this would not affect third world countries so much because they're not so reliant on that infrastructure as we have become. But what I'm talking about are things like a meteor impact, like the Chicxulub impact down in Mexico. They have happened before. They will happen again. The question is when. And of course, if it's too big, it's game over for everybody. If it's too small, then it's just a minor annoyance. Just something to write in your diary for your grandkids to remember. But if it was just the right size and just the right location, that could be a real game changer for modern civilization. A major supervolcanic eruption. Again, another one. Now, I'm talking about a full-sized supervolcano maximum force eruption. That could cause a nuclear winter from the ash cloud. Acid rain, that could cause crop failures for years, decade maybe or more. that could put so much pressure on the global infrastructure that it could break, it could collapse. A massive solar flare taking the entire power grid down over the entire planet. There's no way to recover from that. Even the experts have said if that was to happen, it could be 50 to 100 years before we could have the entire power grid back up and running again, if ever at all. So yeah, things can happen. Another one that could happen would be something like a pandemic. I don't know, I don't mean this wussy COVID thing. I don't know, that's bullshit. I'm talking about a pandemic with teeth. Okay, something that could take out 3/4 to 80% of the population within about a 15-month period, something like that, for which there is no sudden miracle vaccine for. Yeah, any one of those events could happen. And it's like having fire insurance on my house. The way I look at it is, I don't believe my house is going to burn down, especially not anytime soon. I certainly don't want it to burn down, right? I don't wake up in the middle of the night afraid that it's on fire. I don't conduct fire drills on a regular basis. So why do I have fire insurance on my house? Why do I feel like I need fire insurance if I don't believe in that scenario? Well, it's because houses do catch on fire. They have before and they will again, and sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes good people get caught in the middle of bad situations. So it's better to have a plan and be prepared and never see it happen, never need it, than to be watching it happen totally unprepared for it. That's where I'm coming from. So when we're talking about being prepared for a great SHTF or a TEOTWAKI, we're not talking about a few weeks or a couple of months of running out in the forest, hiding in a stealth shelter, snacking on caviar and smoked salmon, and shooting anybody that comes in and tries to take my stuff, and then it all blows over and we come back home and life goes on. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a global disruption that could take 20, 30, 50 years to even begin to recover from. And these events have happened in the past. They do happen. They will happen. Question isn't will, question is when. Now, hopefully, it might be thousands of years from now. Who knows? It could be 5 years from now. Like I said, it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So when we're talking about preparing for these events, one thing we got to remember is we've got to have a long-term view of these. We're talking about decades, all right? Total disruption, or at the very least, major partial disruption of social services. We're talking about having to be more self-reliant than many of us have ever had to be in our lives for decades looking ahead. Not a few weeks, not a few months, not a year or two. So here's what my wife and I did. We sat down and we made up a list of priorities in a situation like this. What would we want to have on hand to help see us through the initial event, then plus the post-event years of just surviving, just day-to-day staying alive, right? And being able to get into and participate in the reconstruction that will become later. So we made up this list. We then prioritized it according to what we really feel like would be most important to us, most important to least important. And yeah, I'll tell you up front, firearms and ammunition, weapons for self-defense and home defense were on the list, but they were not at the top of the list. They were actually down at the bottom of the list because we just don't believe it's going to be a running gunfight. The whole neighborhood isn't going to come up in arms and start banging on our door trying to steal everything we have. Why? Because we don't advertise that we have anything. Well, yeah, kind of, but you'd have to kind of know where we are. But what was on the top of our list actually was food first, / drinking water, / medical supplies. That was the top of the list. And then we had what you could call hunting tools. This would be like archery equipment, bow and arrow, good hunting knife, skinning knife, things like that, hand axe, saw, chainsaw, fuel for cutting firewood, for splitting and curing firewood, which I grew up doing, so I know how to do. I mean, think about it. How many people today who grew up in a city know how to cut a tree down, right? Or cut it up into fireplace-sized chunks, how to season it, how to split it. Now, most people are going to cut their leg off trying. But we do know how to do that here. So, yeah, farm implements, gardening seeds, heirloom seeds, gardening supplies, things like that were really higher up on the list than guns and ammo, to be perfectly honest. Because in the long term, we feel like that is what we're going to need the most of the longest period of time. So, when we talk about food, what are we talking about? Well, that's really what this video is about. There's a lot of different ways to store emergency food, and it really kind of depends on what you're storing for. You know, you've got these 48 and 72-hour emergency kits that you can buy, and those are great things to have. Don't get me wrong. I think everybody should have several of them. They don't take up very much space. You could put one in a closet somewhere, you know, and you've got maybe a week's worth of food and supplies there. They're portable. You can grab one and just throw it in the car and run if you have to. They're great to have. MREs are also an excellent choice. They're expensive if you have a budget to afford them, which we don't for the time frame that we're talking about. Imagine how many MREs it would take to last 20 years. And that's the same thing with commercially prepared canned foods like Spam or canned soups and stuff like that. We do keep some of those, but not for long-term emergencies. We keep them just so if we get hungry and it's, you know, cold, windy, and rainy, and we don't want to get out in the elements, we've got some canned soup. We've got some Spam and bread, and can make a sandwich or can cook up a bowl of hot soup very easily. When we first started prepping, I guess you might say, storing up food, we started out freezing. We'd cook up a little more food than we would need, and then we'd pop it in the freezer. Well, one day I was out there noticing, going through things, cleaning out the stuff that I had to throw away because it had freezer burn, and I noticed that we had 4 freezers. Yeah, and it just kind of seemed like it was such a stupid idea to me. Why we thought that was a good idea to start with, I have no idea. We really didn't sit down and think that through, to be perfectly blunt about it. Because what happens if the power grid goes down? We got 4 freezers worth of food. Yeah, so that very quickly gave way to pressure canning, which I still do today. I love to pressure can food. It's fun. The problem is pressure canned food, while it is an MRE, you can't just open it and eat it. It's pre-cooked. It's bulky, it's cumbersome, it's heavy. Those glass jars are fragile, meaning they're not very portable. If we had to evacuate the house in a hurry, they're likely not going to survive. They get broken very easily. And they take up a lot of space. We do have a finite amount of storage space, and those quart mason jars take up a lot of space. And if I haven't mentioned it yet, they're heavy. Maybe not 1, but 50 are pretty heavy. So from there, we started looking at freeze-dried and dehydrated food. And that's really what this video is about. Dehydrated food versus freeze-dried food. Spoiler alert here, we ultimately made the choice to go with dehydration over freeze-dried. And I kind of wanted to explain that because there's this big bandwagon going on YouTube right now about the virtues of freeze-drying and the advantages of freeze-drying over dehydration. So I did the research on dehydration versus freeze-dried, and 2 factors in particular actually convinced us to go with dehydrating over freeze-dried. But to understand what all that means, kind of got to get started on what is freeze-drying and what is dehydrating. What are these? What are these processes? Well, they both ultimately do the same thing. They preserve food by taking out the water. You see, the microbes and the bacteria that cause food to decompose need oxygen and water. They need the water in the food, and they need the oxygen in the air in order to thrive. They're eating the strawberry. Leave a strawberry sitting out on a countertop, and as it goes bad and spoils and starts molding, That's just the microbes eating it. But if you take that water out, and then also, especially if you take the oxygen away from it, if you deprive those microbes of water and oxygen, they can't grow. And so they either go dormant or they die. And that's why mummies are preserved so well. You take all that water out, that's it. The decomposition process stops, or at least it severely slows down. Freeze drying does this by first freezing the food, and then it uses a vacuum to draw the moisture out in a process called sublimation. And because the food is frozen, the cells are rigid. So as the moisture leaves the cells, they maintain their size and shape as they dry out. And that's why a freeze-dried strawberry looks just like a strawberry. Because it was frozen when it was dried out, the cells were rigid. There you go. Now that's an important point to remember. Keep that in mind. A freeze-dried strawberry is the same shape and size as a fresh strawberry. And also, when they rehydrate, because the cells are large and open, okay, they absorb water very readily and very quickly plump up, I guess you could say, back up to their original texture and color. So you can take that freeze-dried strawberry, soak it in some water, and in a few minutes, you've got pretty much a fresh strawberry. Not exactly, but pretty close, actually. Dehydrating, on the other hand, works by using hot, dry air to blow over the food to force the water out through evaporation. And because it's operating at room temperature, the cells are allowed to shrink, and the cell walls themselves are allowed to shrink. So they shrink, everything shrinks down. Now that causes some physical changes to happen in the proteins making up the walls of those cells. As they shrink, they also get hard, they harden up. And this makes them a little more difficult to rehydrate, and some foods just do not rehydrate well at all compared to freeze drying. There's some pros and cons to both. I'm going to go over those very quickly here. And that is a pro to freeze drying. Dehydrated food is smaller in volume, but it's harder to rehydrate. Now, most foods that freeze dry and dehydrate will rehydrate back up to where they're tasty, they're edible, they're soft, they're nice. You can tell green bean's a green bean. It just won't look as much like a green bean if it's been dehydrated as it will if it's been freeze-dried. Now, there is some advantages to that change that goes on, though, in the molecular structure of the cells of the food stuff, because it can actually enhance the flavor. There's a bean that's very popular in Appalachia called leather britches. And it's very popular it's like a green bean, and it's popular to dry this bean out and then rehydrate it because the flavor and texture changes. And the people that live out in that area think that it tastes much better than when it was fresh. So it can actually enhance the flavor of the food. It could be a 6 and 2 3s. If you close your eyes, you can't tell the difference. It could be that, the freeze-dried food's got a little better texture and a little more fresh color than when it was dehydrated. And depending on the food, you may not want to eat it if it's been dehydrated, just to be blunt. But that's a few rare exceptions. Most foods that freeze dry will dehydrate and will rehydrate very nicely. Okay, not going to go into all that garbage. You can do the research yourself if you want, or if y'all want a follow-up video, I can go into that as well. The two factors, wait a minute, before I get into that, there's another thing about freeze drying that the freeze-dried camp are really promoting, and that is that freeze drying preserves all of the nutritional value of the food, whereas dehydrating doesn't. You lose nutritional value with dehydrating. Okay, yes, with freeze drying, let me reverse that. Let's go with dehydrating because it uses heat. Vitamin C and a couple of B vitamins are sensitive to heat, and you do lose some in dehydrating. Not a lot, not all, in fact, very little, just a couple points, but you do lose some vitamin C, very small amount, and you lose some B vitamins, very small amount compared to freeze drying. But with both methods, all of the protein, the fiber, the minerals, all of the vitamins like A, the D, the E, many of the B vitamins, the K, I mean, all of those remain perfectly intact with dehydrating food. So this is one of those claims being made by the freeze-dried camp that technically is true. You can't really say they're lying, but it's kind of being presented out of context. It's a bit of an exaggeration. The difference is so little that when my wife and I looked at it, we just said, big deal. So what? So edibility, it's a 6 and 2/3 for us. Again, depends on your priorities, right? For us, edibility is a 6 and 2/3 because we're not picky eaters to start with, and we've eaten freeze-dried food, we have, and we've eaten dehydrated, our own especially, and the difference just isn't that big a deal to us. Portability is the same because you're removing the water, so the weight is the same, okay? Nutritional value is the same as far as we're concerned. So the two factors that pushed us over to dehydrating versus freeze-drying. Well, one, remember back on that freeze-dried strawberry being the same size and shape as a fresh strawberry. That means in a finite amount of space, you can only store as many freeze-dried strawberries as you can store fresh strawberries. Same thing with green beans, same thing with meat, same thing with potatoes, carrots, broccoli, everything. You can only store the same amount of freeze-dried food in a given amount of space as you can the same food fresh. There's no gains there. Now let me show you something here. This is dehydrated green beans. Okay, this is a 4-quart bag. It's not completely full. This is a bag that two of these are now in this bag. So this represents 2 of these. And I don't mean 2 up to the seal here. This thing was full and overflowing. It was stuffed full of green beans. And I put 2 of these in this one bag. And these will rehydrate. They'll gain back probably 3/4 of their size and texture and softness. They'll taste just like a green bean. In a soup or a stew, you won't notice the difference. If you're hungry, if you're really hungry especially, you won't fire truck and care. And I could put twice as much of these in the same volume, dehydrated, as I can freeze-dried. Now for us, when we're looking at prepping for one of these TEOTWAKI events, should they ever happen, again, we're looking long-term, 10, 20, 30 years to recovery from one of these major events. And ultimately, it is going to be just a flip of the coin, a roll of the dice. The coin lands heads up, you come out of it alive, it lands tails up, somebody else gets all of your supplies. And that's just the way it's going to be. But you can do some things to help weigh that dice and that coin in our favor. And having a good supply of food is one of them. So one of our 2 priorities really was to maximize storage capacity. And we can put 2 up to 5 times the amount of food in the same space using dehydration as we can using freeze drying. Let me give you another example. This started life out as 14 quarts of chili. This is a 4-quart, 1-gallon freezer bag. 14 quarts. Now granted, there was sauce and juice in this, so if we freeze dried that same 14 quarts, it would shrink a little because you lose the water that was in the sauce, okay? So it would go down to about 12 quarts. But still, 12 quarts of freeze dried versus 4 quarts dehydrated in the same baggie. You'd need 3 of these if it was freeze dried compared to 1 dehydrated. Same chili, same food. When it reconstitutes, you won't know the difference. In fact, my company doesn't have an annual chili cook-off competition, but if they did and they ever do start one, I'm going to enter this because I could enter my chili, my dehydrated, reconstituted chili with mushrooms and meat. I could rehydrate that and serve it in a chili competition and possibly win the company level, maybe, maybe not among professional cooks, but home cooking, yeah, it's that good. So that was one of the 2 factors that pushed us over to dehydrating. Now the second factor was startup and operating costs. Yeah, dehydrators and freeze dryers come in a wide range of brands, styles, capabilities, and cost. So you got to kind of take this, keep this relative, all right? When I did the research on just the purchase cost of freeze-dried machines versus dehydrators, when I found a machine that we felt we would be comfortable with, that we would be happy with, would serve our needs as a freeze dryer, we settled on one that cost $3,000. Okay, I could go to Walmart and I could buy a Nesco 5-tray dehydrator. Now it's nothing fancy, it doesn't have special controls, it's not programmable, no time delay. You know, it doesn't adjust its settings for meat or veggies or fruit. It doesn't monitor the moisture of the exhaust air and turn itself off when the food's just right. It's got an on-off switch. Okay, 5 trays, retailed $100. Now I happen to get mine on sale for $60. But even if we paid retail $100 for that little Nesco 5-tray dehydrator, I could buy 30 of those for what one freeze dryer that we knew we would be happy with would cost. And the annual maintenance is higher on the freeze dryer. They're not maintenance free. Don't believe that. You do start looking at the reviews, start talking to people who bought them. Yes, they do require some annual preventive maintenance to keep them going. The dehydrator, you can run it till it falls apart, go buy another one. 30 of them for what that same freeze dryer costs. Or I could use that extra $2,900 to buy a hell of a lot of food to put in that dehydrator. So that was really, those two factors was really convinced us to dehydrate. And we've been doing it now for, 10 years, I guess. Not every day, you know, but a couple times a month on a weekend. I'll keep the dehydrator running all weekend. And we'll buy some food just for dehydrating. And we'll make up like MRE type meals, and then we'll also just dehydrate vegetables like, you know, chili or just, you know, the green beans by themselves. It's just green beans. And we've also got mixed vegetables and things like that. And so I'm not trying to convince anybody to choose dehydrating over freeze drying. Freeze drying is very popular. It's popular for a reason. There's nothing wrong with freeze drying. There are some pros to it if those pros are higher up your list of priorities than the dehydrating, right? Or if the cons of one or the other are higher up on your list of priorities, then that's what you should use to make your decision. Just understand that you are going to need a bigger budget with freeze drying. If that's not a problem, then go for it. You are going to need more space to store the same amount of food in. For what I could store a year's worth of food freeze dried in, I could store 3 to 5 years worth of dehydrated food. But it does come at a loss, some in texture, color, and taste, if that's important to you. So anyway, if you already have one or the other and you're happy with it, great, keep going. All right, everybody should have something. If your idea of preparing is to buy canned chicken, Spam, and pork and beans, then go for it. You got to have some emergency food put back. That's a great idea. MREs, 70-hour emergency kits, anything, really. Sorry about that. I had to move the camera. You can see the sun's coming up over the house. It was hitting the camera, causing lens flare. I looked like a ghost. Anyway, if you're thinking about putting back some emergency food and you're looking at all the different alternatives, different methods to use, and you're comparing freeze-dried with dehydrating, and you're not sure which you might want to go with, hopefully you might find some of the information I've given you today useful or helpful. If not, then I apologize. If you've already made the decision to freeze dry, then fine. If you're happy with it, go for it. So anyway, that's my video for this week, and thanks for watching, and see you next time.